Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tom Cooney. I'm with General Motors. It's my great honor to welcome you to this very important conversation that we're going to have today about America's role in the world. I'm currently with General Motors, but it's my honor to introduce this session because I had the amazing opportunity to serve our country for 25 years in the U.S. Foreign Service as a diplomat, and multiple times in China and in Latin America. And I've come back to my Detroit roots with General Motors. So we'll have a very important conversation with Congressman Peter Meijer today about America's role in the world and how that role matters more than ever to our local communities. I'm proud to call myself a member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's Michigan Advisory Committee. This committee is co-chaired by Meijer's executive chairman, Hank Meijer. It was also co-chaired by our longtime Michigan Senator Carl Levin until his passing last year. We're a strong organization. We're over 95 Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We're leaders of the business, humanitarian, and education communities, civic officials, military veterans, and everybody who believes that America must continue to be a global leader. Our world is small, and it seems like it's growing smaller by the day. I'm sure that many of you have found yourself tuning in today precisely because you understand how connected our security and our prosperity in Michigan and in the United States are with the rest of the world. The issues that we'll talk about impact all Americans, and it's our hope that when we leave here today, you will each continue this critical discussion with your circles. Share what you've learned about America's role in the world with your families and your friends and your colleagues at work and elsewhere. So thank you for joining us today. Again, I'd like to welcome the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's National Engagement Director, Michelle Bekkering, to set the scene for today's conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, and welcome and good morning, Michigan. As Tom mentioned, my name is Michelle Bekkering, and I am the Director of National Engagement here at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And it's an honor to be here with our special guest, Congressman Peter Meijer, whom I will formally welcome in just a bit. And I would like to thank the members of our bipartisan Michigan Advisory Committee, co-chaired by Hank Meijer, our executive chairman of Meijer Inc., who helped make today's program possible, and we truly appreciate your support. I also want to thank Cargill, who serves as chair of USGLC's Heartland Initiative. We are proud to have their support as we host conversations like this throughout the Heartland. And a special thanks to USGLC's Global Impact Project partners who help conduct our important work all across the country. So, who are we? At USGLC, we bring together a diverse network of businesses, humanitarian organizations, military veterans, faith-based leaders, and foreign policy luminaries. What brings us together is our shared belief in the importance of America's global leadership. We believe that strategic investments in diplomacy and development are essential to protecting our national security, to advancing our economic interests, and to protecting the very best of our American values. It's also why we talk about how a tiny 1% of the federal budget, which is called the International Affairs budget, is one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments that America makes. It's why we've been asking our communities around the country, foreign aid, what's it worth? We've asked diplomacy, what's it worth? Well, it's funding our diplomats around the world. It's support for our key allies. It's including working with our NATO allies to meet the needs of the Ukrainian people and helping them fight back against Russia's invasion. It's feeding the world. What's it worth? It's tackling the emerging global food crisis and preventing malnutrition in children and other vulnerable communities around the world. Global health, what's it worth? It's our efforts to lead the global response to end the COVID-19 pandemic and invest in preparedness to stop future pandemics from wrecking the global supply chain. Now, I understand it can be a challenge to see past the current headlines of today's global crises, but we get such an incredible return on our investment for this small expenditure. And we have seen tremendous progress over the last several decades of this investment. Let me outline just a few of these. Since 1990, the number of people around the world living in extreme poverty, that's living on less than $1.25 a day, has been cut in half. That's 1 billion fewer people living in extreme poverty today. We're also on the verge of ending diseases like polio and malaria and actually achieving an AIDS-free generation. And today, the fastest growing economies are in the developing world. And American businesses are taking advantages of those opportunities. That includes businesses right here in Michigan, where you annually export more than $44 billion in goods. And almost 19.3% of the jobs here in the state are directly related to that trade. So I want to thank you for being part of our journey to build a better, safer, more prosperous world. And we are fortunate today to be joined by a true expert who's going to help us think through all of this. And I'm pleased to introduce him now. Congressman Peter Meijer represents Michigan's 3rd District and was elected to Congress in 2020. He serves on the very powerful Foreign Affairs, Homeland Security, and Science, Space, and Technology committees. Congressman Meijer is no stranger to international work. From his service in the Army to his work with humanitarian assistance and relief operations in South Sudan, the Philippines, and Afghanistan, he knows firsthand why we must invest in all of our soft and hard tools of national power. So that's development, it's diplomacy, and defense to keep America safe, secure, and prosperous. USGLC had the honor to hear from Congressman Meijer during our 2021 tribute celebration, and we're honored to welcome him back for today's conversation. So with that, Congressman Meijer, welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. It's an honor to be here and I look forward to this conversation.
Well, the pleasure is really ours. And I have to say, it's not every day another Dutch American gets to interview another Dutch American. So we're a small but mighty part of the population here in the States. So thank you. So I want to set some framing remarks here for our conversation. And I don't think it will be a surprise to you. I want to start and talk about Ukraine. And I know this is a country you've been following closely, you've been talking about a lot. So let's start the conversation here. Ukraine. I think we're going to be talking for a very long time about the effects of Russia's unprovoked invasion. And I was looking at the statistics this morning, and they're startling. As of today, we have more than 4.5 million Ukrainians. That's 10% of the population have already fled the country. Within the country itself, 6.5 million are displaced from their homes. And that equals the largest migration crisis in Ukraine since World War II, which is just incredible. So you've got, people displaced, you have livelihoods and homes destroyed, and then you have access to food and medical services limited. And unfortunately, the tragedy doesn't end there, right? We're seeing and knowing that the tragic effects are reverberating across the region and across the world. And in fact, studies estimate that up to 1.7 billion people across the world will now be brought into poverty and hunger because of this. And I think so many people here in the United States, if you look at polling, it has shown that unfortunately the Ukrainian crisis has sort of refocused Americans, right, on the importance of engaging abroad and why what happens abroad really does affect us here at home. And listen, you've had such a wonderful service, and not only in the U.S. Army, but now in Congress. Specifically, you work in the Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security committees. So you have a really unique perspective on what's going on in Ukraine. So I would love to really hear from you from this leadership vantage point. Why is it important that America continue to lead globally, and specifically through this lens in Ukraine, right? Why does investing now in Ukraine matter to our national security here at home?
I think that's the question that I frankly thought would come up a little bit more, that we would have to be making that affirmative case, and that there could be a strong debate among the American people, and a debate that gets drawn into our very polarized politics. I'm glad to see that hasn't really been as much of a question or a concern that we have had to proactively address, but to really just lay it out there. There's certainly isolationist trends on both sides of the aisle. When it comes to supporting Ukraine, when it comes to making sure that we're providing the defensive weaponry the Ukrainians are asking for, when it comes to making sure we are providing the humanitarian support to try to restabilize or at least adapt and help the neighboring countries throughout Europe, whether it's Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, helping them adapt to the very large refugee inflows that they're seeing, to support the internally displaced Ukrainians, mostly towards the west, towards Lviv. There hasn't been the concern, or there hasn't been the skepticism that I initially feared, because I think that reflexive recognition that a destabilized Europe, that a Russia that is free to be a spoiler and to be a destabilizing impact around its periphery. We go back to 2008 in Georgia. You look at what Russia has done in Syria, all so that they can support their TARDIS and Mediterranean Sea access. You look at what the Wagner Group has done throughout Africa. When things are at a low burn or low boil, it's I think a little bit easier to ignore it and to not recognize that malicious intervention for what it truly is. But the invasion of Ukraine, I think the scales fell off the eyes, right? I mean, if Putin had gone in thinking that the U.S. is retreating from the world, which I think is a conclusion, both after the past administration and the current administration's actions in Afghanistan, and just hesitation at projecting American influence, and I think hesitation for understandable reasons. But that could lead an outside observer such as Vladimir Putin to make the assumption that the U.S. is retreating from that global position of responsibility. And then when you then kind of overlay the US's role with where I think a lot of the pundit class thought NATO was in terms of strength. And I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday who, made the point, and somebody I knew from Afghanistan and had spent time with in Lebanon, and he had, spent time in a lot of those different areas, and just saying, you go back and read some of the foreign policy articles or some of the interviews folks were giving back in January and February, and you just see how Vladimir Putin wasn't the only one who didn't appreciate the strength of NATO, who didn't appreciate how much the Western world, how much that transatlantic alliance, how much, frankly, the American people still have that understanding that stability and prosperity around the world benefit us. Even if we can't connect those dots very directly, we get that sense that this is wrong. There's kind of that visceral, Putin shouldn't be able to do this. The Ukrainians are in the right. We should help them out. And that has been a case that we haven't had to make. It hasn't gotten to that extent of within a polarized political world. And granted, I have spent all of about 15 months in office. I have never seen the amount of strong bipartisan support for an issue that I've seen around Ukraine. 90% of the House are on the exact same page. You have 5% that are maybe a little bit more isolationist, 5% a little bit more interventionist, but 90% on the same page. And then we're about 80% on the same page with the White House. Sometimes we wish they would go a little bit faster, a little bit further, be a little bit more aggressive and not as hesitant in some domains. But it is really, I think, a fantastic example of what, even in a polarized time, right? We are overly focused on the areas of division. And I think this was the same thing with the assessments of NATO. We're overly focused on the points of contention. And I think if you're looking at 5 areas where we have a dispute or a disagreement and are not on the same page, it's easy to forget that in 95 other places, we are joined at the hip, or there's no daylight between those positions. And I think Putin was focusing on the 5%. We were maybe overly sensitive to the 5%, but the invasion of Ukraine and the Western response showed that 5% is only 5%, and 95% we are there. Nobody, I think, if you would have told them 3 months ago that where we are today, Sweden and Finland would be dropping, applications to join NATO. That Switzerland would abandon, centuries of neutrality. I mean, Sweden was neutral since, I think, 1620, right? I mean, this has reframed that understanding, and I think very much underscored the perils and dangers of the world. And in my view, has shown that the post-World War II peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed, with plenty of conflicts along the way, but nothing on the orders of magnitude that we saw in World War II or World War I, that post-World War II order was not arrived at accidentally. It was the result of investment and sacrifices. And in order to continue it, we need to continue to sacrifice and invest, for that greater good, which pays benefits that are both tangible in terms of trade relations and intangible in terms of being able to make sure that a free and prosperous world, that individuals have the right to choose their government, that countries have the right to determine their own fate, that those set of values are still very powerful. And there's a long thread connecting countries that share them.
Well, and Congressman, I want to build on that. And you're so right. And it's hard to say there have been positives, right? But in some ways, it isn't just sort of an awakening here. But to your point, look at the international response. It is incredible, to your point. We now see countries that have for a long time been sort of neutral, right? Switzerland is such a great example, and other countries saying, it is no longer a time to be passive. We have to be engaged. And to your point, we have seen such a bipartisan coming together, even in our own country, around this issue. And, in some ways, I think we have to see that positive sort of awakening, not only in our own country, but around the world, of saying, this is a time now to rally together. And there was something you said recently that really struck me. And I do wonder if it is what's really drawing this international response. And it was, and you said this, and it really did chill me. You said freedom and democracy is hanging in the balance as the war in Ukraine continues. And I think we've all seen that, right? This is a war on democracy. It is a war on sort of these liberal ideals we all hold so dear. And maybe that is, again, what some of us now are seeing in these countries, that it's like, this is what we're standing up to. So I want to move on and talk about another issue that is really important. And while Michigan is a premier manufacturing state, you're also one of the leading in agriculture as well. So I touched a little bit about one of the concerns we have with rising food insecurity. And this will definitely be an impact that's coming out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right now, Russia and Ukraine supply 30% of the global wheat exports in the world. And obviously now the war has disrupted those supply chains. But beyond that, you also have farmers and other agricultural workers literally fighting on the front lines, right? So you have fields that have become battlegrounds, and you're going to have tens of thousands of smallholder farmers not able to plant new crops. So we're seeing across the world, right, the prices of crops and meat and vegetable oils rising to their highest levels. And we're going to frankly see, more, import dependent countries pushed into, frankly, higher levels of food insecurity. And the World Food Program recently came out with a warning that 285 million people around the world are really facing starvation. So just wanted to, ask you, how is U.S. global leadership, helping address growing food insecurity? And what is the correlation there between that and our national security?
Yeah, I think we're very finely attuned to the impacts of inflation at home, right? I mean, and that's driven in any number of different buckets. But it's important to remember that Americans, we spend around 8.5% of our disposable income on food. There are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or in many places of the developing world, where it's not 8.5%, it is 70, 80, 85%. And so if food prices go up 50%, in the US, it goes from 8.5 to 12% or so of disposable income. So that is something that'll be felt by families, but it's nothing compared to what happens if that 50% rise, means it goes from 80% of your disposable income to 100%, and you're still not able to provide food, for your family. How quickly we're able to get some of the grain that is already in storage in Odessa, get that out, essentially the blockade of Ukraine, in the Black Sea, that, setting aside the Sea of Azov, which is, wholly cut off, but even within the Black Sea, trying to get some of those grains out of there will be incredibly difficult. And to your point, we're in the window right now where those Ukrainian farmers, if they're not planting those seeds, if they're not, getting the crops in the ground, right now, we're not going to have, the crop yields that are needed to be able to sustain global food production. Now, there's some ways in which we have at the global level some rice reserves. We can do a little bit of shifting when it comes to, and when I say we, I mean this is the global economy, the market will be able to shift a little bit, but that impact is going to be felt. And I think to the earlier point in conversation we had, it shows that this is not you cannot just wall off a country. You cannot just say this war that's occurring in Ukraine won't have ramifications, outside the borders. It could lead to, civil unrest and political revolutions in developing countries. It could lead to widespread famine. It could lead to widespread migration of individuals, simply because of that food insecurity, and what first, second, and third order effects, spin out from there, are impossible to predict. And so it's all the more reason why, we should be pushing for a degree of stability. We should be pushing to get things back to normal. And we should ensure that that sense of normalcy is not achieved through, surrender, but through an active assertion of self-determination by, countries like Ukraine.
Absolutely. Well, now I would like to open up the floor to some of our advisory committee members. So I'm going to first call to the floor Chuck Lipstrow. And Chuck, if you can just tell us who you're with, please.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I'm Chuck Lipstrow. I'm president of the Michigan Agribusiness Association. And in my personal capacity, a constituent over in East Grand Rapids, appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, Congressman. Building on the very important conversation that I just heard, and couldn't underscore your comments enough, Congressman, the impact, the downstream impact for agriculture, including agribusinesses here in Michigan. The situation in Ukraine is very serious. So appreciate your comments on the need to return to normal and to get Ukraine back into the marketplace. I'd like to talk a little bit about the broader agricultural trade picture right now. Ag trade is a huge economic driver for our state. We export anywhere from $2 to $3 billion worth of agricultural products every year out of Michigan. In fact, that number increased even the past couple of years during the pandemic. Our farmers and local businesses have really worked hard to figure out supply chains and keep product moving out of Michigan to grow our economy, but we need new markets. As you know, because last month we noted that you joined more than 90 of your colleagues on a strong bipartisan basis to reach out to the U.S. Trade Representative and to Secretary Vilsack at USDA to urge them to prioritize agriculture in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, an effort to reestablish global trade to that region. And first, thank you for doing that. That's very important for Michigan, and there's incredible new market opportunities, not just in our state, but across American agriculture. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the Indo-Pacific region, the importance for Michigan farmers and rural businesses of making sure agriculture is a priority as we re-engage in that region. And if you could give some overall comments on the importance of trade to support U.S. leadership in the Indo-Pacific region, which is obviously incredibly important right now. Again, thanks for the opportunity to ask a question.
Thank you. And just briefly on Ukraine, Chuck, as an East Grand Rapids resident, our current ambassador to Slovakia, Bridget Brink, who was just nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, is a East Grand Rapids High School alumni. So, West Michigan is pushing out very firmly into the world, even more so. But to your point on agribusiness, I think it's important to look at both. Well, agribusiness and Michigan involved in the world, there's two main components. One is what are we actually pushing out, in the export market directly from the state of Michigan. And then number two, how can exports from other places, such as, I'll take the apple industry for example. Michigan's 3rd district has the largest amount of apple production in the state, but or to the degree to which that apple production is distributed domestically, has a lot to do with how much apple production on the West Coast ends up being exported, right? So when we have a diversified and geographically diversified, agribusiness, if some areas are focusing on the export market because of their, centrality to ports or their ability to get that into an international supply chain, that then has, effects on the domestic consumption elsewhere within the agribusiness. And I think Ukraine actually had Ukraine and Poland are they import a lot of Michigan, they export a significant amount of agro products that have labor inputs. Right? Apple juice is a great example. Where something that requires a lower cost of labor along that production chain in the agro production chain, will see some degree of outsourcing. And that I think is inevitably going to present challenges to our domestic producers, especially when there is less concern of expiration or less concern that you need a rapid timeliness. If you can have a cold chain along that process, and we're seeing a lot of that with fruits that require some degree of processing and packaging in not kind of the raw product, but the cut varieties. And I think this is where the Biden administration still has an opportunity. I don't think that window is fully closed, to get away from some of the just bizarre misconceptions that came about around the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the latter stages of the 2016 presidential cycle. Donald Trump saw it as an easy thing to rail against and campaign against, and then Hillary Clinton found it difficult to explain the benefits of participating in that trade arrangement. And the next thing we know, something that could have been a very strong check on Chinese influence, that could have assisted the U.S. in diversifying our economic dependence on China. When the U.S. steps away from that table, China is able to slowly nudge closer and closer and closer to the point where some of the initial impulse and the initial goals of that Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations have totally flown by the wayside, and we are missing that key critical window right now to reassert the U.S. to make good on the supposed Pacific pivot that we've been hearing about for quite some time. But I think that's where we need to continue to recognize that from a value standpoint, from a governmental standpoint, we will always be a bit more closely aligned with Western Europe with that transatlantic relationship. But when it comes to making sure that we have a diversified network of trade and that we are asserting a degree of stability, it's very easy to look at what impacts Russian aggression against Ukraine will have on President Xi making an assessment of how to proceed with Taiwan, right? And that's something I can go into in a little bit more detail. But I think it is a real tremendous opportunity, both to support prosperity domestically, to support our export market and our producers at home, but also to use that as a way of making sure that we are interwoven to promote sustainable political practices and just an overall sense of stability, especially within a volatile region like the Indo-Pacific.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Okay, next we have Jody Hope Michaels. And Jody, if you can tell us again who you're with.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning. My name is Jody Michaels. I serve as the Executive Director of Global Ties Kalamazoo. We are a citizen diplomacy organization based here in West Michigan, enriching local community across our area with global diversity. And we just returned to in-person programming after a very long hiatus. One of the main programs we implement is the International Visitor Leadership Program, funded through the U.S. Department of State. And earlier this month, we hosted a dynamic group of women leaders from Moldova here in both Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids through the Congressional Office for International Leadership's Open World program. More of us have been watching their country with growing concern over the past couple of days. And, you know, as has been the case throughout our morning, Ukraine is top of mind for many and for policymakers. But we can't lose sight of the full array of urgent and global threats: strategic competition with China, rising authoritarianism, global economic uncertainty, among others. And China, as you've alluded to, has been watching events in Ukraine quite closely, and continued conflict could tip the global economy into recession. With growing humanitarian crises, including in Yemen and Ethiopia, we look forward to significant fiscal year 2023 international affairs budget that is robust. How can the United States effectively balance emerging global threats as we remain so focused on Ukraine?
I mean, I was just having a meeting last night with some folks who are working very aggressively on Afghanistan, and folks who are deeply involved in making sure that we're not only taking care of some of those folks who are left behind and getting them out, working on the evacuation, but also laying the groundwork for the next stage of U.S.-Afghan relations. You know, the word Ukraine is a very frustrating one because it has taken a lot of attention away from that issue. And I entirely reject the notion that the U.S. cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. I think the idea, and this has been my frustration with our foreign policy approach and national security approach for far too long, is that we look at the world as a series of problems to solve, rather than acknowledging these are challenges to manage, right? We cannot, be laser focused on one thing to the exclusion of everything else, because it's an interconnected world, and there are 1,000 different ways that there will be those first, second, and third order effects. And so we need to be omnipresent. We need to be omni-aware. We may be plussing up our resources or devoting more attention at times, but that cannot be to the exclusion of everything else. You mentioned Moldova, and we saw yesterday a kind of bizarre incident in the Transnistria, which is a breakaway region of Moldova on the Ukrainian-Moldovan border, that is a very bizarre kind of throwback relic to the Cold War Soviet Union times. But it has been one of these little, similar to the Donbass, it has, or Nagorno-Karabakh, it's been one of these areas that the Russians have been able to use simmering, or Ossetia, the Georgian border, have been able to use continual destabilization and political unrest to weaken, the country that surrounds it. It's kind of a wound that's held open that the Russians are able to kind of, press their thumb on and cause and inflict a degree of pain. I think the incident in Transnistria, I think it could have very well been it was an attack on a government facility. Some rockets were launched. I didn't think it was highly substantive, but the fear is that could be a pretext for the Russians to really extend that belt of influence, from the Donbass through to Mariupol, to the land bridge to Crimea, and then extending through to Odessa, and then the Moldovan border, and really trying to justify more of a Sea of Azov, Black Sea belt of influence. But that's just what impact could have on something occurring right on that border, let alone what additional destabilizing impacts could occur in areas such as, Afghanistan is something that's very near and dear to my heart, but wanting to make sure that in the U.S. reevaluating their position, we're not creating an opening for China to then, press further into Central Asia. We are not, giving the impression in the Straits of Taiwan that we are now backing away and that we are or retreating. So within the context of a global world, within the context of our kind of globalized approach, it is essential that we never think that anything occurs in isolation. It will always, there are pieces of connectivity, whether it is the assumption of American leadership and American strength, whether it is a question of our commitment to our allies or our willingness to project force, all of that is going to have an impact in terms of how other countries judge, how the U.S. will respond and what the state of play in the world is at the moment.
Great. Thank you, Jody. Okay, next we have Pranati Karadia.
Hello. Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to ask a question as well. So I'm actually Pranati Karadia from USGLC, Michigan Advisory Committee, also the COO of a freight forwarding company. So we do handle a lot of international shipments to Ukraine. Previously, it was for the used car market, but right now that Ukrainian American clientele has shifted towards humanitarian aid. So I guess my question is about the strengthening of supply chains. And obviously the war has severely disrupted the still recovering global supply chain. And with Michigan being vulnerable to these external shocks, with 20% of jobs, more than 1.1 million are supported by international trade. So Michigan automakers who have been hit really hard by these disruptions, as Russia and Ukraine are critical suppliers of raw materials to produce catalytic converters and semiconductors. In early April, you introduced the bipartisan Protecting Semiconductor Supply Chain Materials for Authoritarians Act. And that was to develop strategies to bolster supplies of critical raw materials and to monitor potential threats to the semiconductor supply chains. So what I want to ask is why it's so important that America leads globally in securing and strengthening critical supply chain, which you've touched upon, but also if you can share how this legislation particularly will specifically protect Michiganders from continued supply chain disruptions.
And I think I really appreciate that question and that elaboration. I think the auto industry, when we say supply chain disruption, that has so many different causes. It has so many different impacts. It's different on the agricultural side of the house. It's different when it comes to oil and gas and energy. It's going to be different when it comes to the more diversified manufacturing and things that are dependent on both challenges around raw materials, challenges around labor, challenges around transportation. All of that plays in. But with the auto industry in particular, you mentioned that the catalytic converters, the extraordinary amount of nickel that is produced by Russia that we are that either Russians can withhold or that we can place bans on the export of a specific product, those are going to be felt, right? And so all of those dependencies are bits of leverage that an authoritarian country like the one led by Vladimir Putin are able to use in order to project their own influence and their own force. So to put it very bluntly, we saw in the 1970s and 80s when OPEC was able to have a stranglehold on oil exports, that those downstream effects are felt. All of those are dependencies that we are enabling and that we are allowing. So I am a firm proponent in kind of a finely tuned system where we make sure that we have self-sufficiency, that we have the ability to not be dependent on other countries for resources. We are uniquely blessed in ways that many of our European allies are not, in being able to produce domestically. And even if those costs are a little bit higher, even if maybe there are advantages to being tied in, making sure we're retaining that backstop so that we are not putting ourselves in a position of dependency. And when we look at both the semiconductor supply chain on the material side, the highly complex fabrication process that is implicit in making some of the incredible logic chips, memory chips, and kind of processing chips that are the backbone of our technological interface and much of our consumer electronics space, in addition to our defense electronics, in addition to the next in addition to the automotive sector, right? I mean, it touches on everything. It's important that we are identifying domestically, what minerals we have, that we are creating the ability to access those, that we are, I was talking with Daniel Yergin, and he said, we need to set aside the notion of big oil, and we need to focus on what big shovel looks like. I mean, mining, minerals, mining, metals, mining, that is going to be how we ensure that we are avoiding those dependencies down the line, that we are not having bottlenecks or constraints, that the supply of lithium or nickel or cobalt or cadmium, that those are not going to be inhibiting our ability to make whatever energy transitions are afoot, to be able to respond and be engaged productively in the next iteration of the complex materials and critical minerals value chain. We need to make sure that we understand fully what we have, because those are strategic reserves, no different than what we have up in Alaska or what we have off our coast when it comes to oil and gas reserves that we can be tapping into if we need to in order to backstop that more full global market. But what we were looking to do with that legislation is to coordinate across different elements of the government so that we are identifying best practices, that we are streamlining processes. This is going to be a long multi-step transition, and we're working on other things like the CHIPS and the FABS Act around both investment tax credits and some subsidies to domesticate, or either redomesticate or encourage the onshoring of semiconductor material supply chains, whether that's the wafers, whether that's the packaging components, so that we are not putting all of our eggs in very critical sectors abroad, where we're increasing our vulnerability. So the goal is to lay some of the groundwork for that in this legislation, and also to make sure we're not looking at this as a one-time thing, but recognizing that our independence and our ability to be self-sufficient in this area allows us to come to the world from a position of strength, rather than, as are some of our European allies are challenged on the natural gas side, rather than having these clear vulnerabilities that could be exploited.
Great, thank you, Pranati. Congressman Meijer, thank you. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for walking us through what are undoubtedly some very pressing challenges to manage. Thank you for your insight, but thank you also for, I have to say, giving us hope. It is very, I think, empowering to know we have leaders like you who are managing these very thorny issues on our behalf. And with that, to close us out, I want to hand the floor over to my colleague, Nezar Jamal.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, Congressman Meijer, also for this engaging conversation and for being able to go so in depth on these issues in such a short amount of time. I also want to thank our Michigan Advisory Committee members and our Veterans for Smart Power members who across Michigan and across the United States are helping us advocate for these important issues. We're really appreciative for everyone who joined this conversation, to thank the Congressman for his support for America's global leadership. Thanking your member of Congress and sharing your positions is critical to keeping America's leadership around the globe strong, so that we protect our economic interests, our national security, and our humanitarian values as Americans. Your voice, which is one of many in USGLC's national bipartisan coalition, makes all of the difference. I also want to say that I want to make sure folks don't miss USGLC's Global Impact Forum, which will be held in person in Washington, D.C. this year on June 13th and 14th. We'll be bringing together top political and policy leaders alongside thousands of diverse voices like your own from the business, nonprofit, faith, and national security communities from across this country for a dynamic and live conversation. Registration is now open, and I hope to see you in Washington this June. Additionally, for up-to-the-minute updates, make sure you're on our mailing list and follow us on Twitter at USGLC. Thank you again for your support. I really enjoy hearing from all of you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with folks in Michigan and across our country. Thank you, and stay well.